The divorce of Nathaniel Cross and Genevieve Sinclair was supposed to be a massacre, not a mystery. Nathaniel, a real estate mogul with an ego larger than the skyscrapers he built, had hired the most vicious legal team in New York. His goal wasn't just to leave his wife of 20 years, but to erase her, to strip her of every penny and leave her destitute as punishment for boring him. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to the details. As Nathaniel smirked from the witness stand, convinced of his victory, he didn't realize that the dusty, leather-bound deed sitting on the judge's bench didn't belong to him. It belonged to a history he had ignored and a woman he had severely underestimated. When Judge Banks finally adjusted his glasses and read the name on the parchment, the silence in the courtroom wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of an empire crumbling. The mahogany doors of courtroom 4B in the Manhattan Civil Courthouse swung open with a heavy, portentous creak, admitting a blast of conditioned air and the scent of expensive cologne. Nathaniel Cross entered first, striding down the aisle as if he were cutting a ribbon at one of his grand openings. He was a man who took up space intentionally, standing 6'2" with silver fox hair perfectly coiffed and a jawline that had graced the cover of Fortune magazine 3 times. Nathaniel was the picture of American success. He checked his platinum Patek Philippe watch, a subtle flex for the gallery of onlookers. He knew they were there. The press had been camping out since 4 a.m. This wasn't just a divorce. It was the dissolution of the Cross dynasty. "Chin up, Nathaniel," whispered his lead attorney, Bradley Whitman. Whitman was a shark in a 3-piece suit, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to destroy lives. "This will be over before lunch. She has no leverage. The prenup is ironclad, and the assets are all in LLCs she can't touch." "I'm not worried, Bradley," Nathaniel replied, his voice a smooth baritone that carried to the back of the room. "I just want to make sure she understands why this is happening. Mediocrity should never burden greatness." He sat down at the plaintiff's table, smoothing his silk tie. Across the aisle, the defendant's table was empty. Nathaniel smirked. Late. Typical. She probably couldn't figure out the subway map now that the driver is gone. 2 minutes later, the side door opened quietly. Genevieve Sinclair walked in. She was the antithesis of her husband. Where he was flashy, she was muted. She wore a simple charcoal grey dress that had seen better days, her brown hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She carried no designer handbag, only a worn leather satchel filled with papers. She didn't look at the press. She didn't look at the gallery. She walked with her head down, her posture slightly hunched, as if she were apologizing for her very existence. "Look at her," Nathaniel muttered to Whitman, shaking his head. 20 years I tried to mold her, tried to give her class, and she walks in here looking like a librarian who just got fired. "Focus," Whitman said, opening his laptop. "The judge is Leonard Banks. He's old school. Doesn't like theatrics, but he respects property rights. That's good for us." Genevieve took her seat. She was alone. No team of associates, no shark in a suit. Just her, a notepad, and a glass of water. "Where is her counsel?" Whitman frowned, leaning forward. "Maybe she couldn't afford one after I froze the joint accounts?" Nathaniel chuckled darkly. The bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Leonard Banks presiding." Judge Banks emerged from his chambers like a storm cloud rolling over a mountain. He was a man in his late 60s, African-American, with a face etched by decades of listening to lies. He moved slowly, burdened by a slight limp, but his eyes were sharp, darting between the two tables with terrifying intelligence. He sat down, the leather chair groaning under his weight, and adjusted the heavy black robes. "Be seated," Banks grumbled, He shuffled a stack of files in front of him, the paper rustling, echoing in the silent room. He looked over his reading glasses at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Cross, Mr. Whitman, I see you've brought the cavalry." "We believe in being prepared, Your Honor," Whitman said smoothly. "And Mrs. Cross?" The judge's eyes shifted to Genevieve. He paused. "Ms. Sinclair, I should say. You are appearing pro se. You are representing yourself in a divorce involving nearly $2 billion in assets." Genevieve stood up. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, forcing everyone in the room to lean in. "Yes, Your Honor. I didn't want to waste the court's time with unnecessary arguments. I just want what is fair." Nathaniel snorted audibly. Whitman kicked him under the table. "Fair," Judge Banks repeated, the word rolling around his mouth like a marble. "In my courtroom, fair is a legal term, not a sentimental one." "Very well. Let's proceed. Mr. Whitman, you may begin your opening statement." Whitman stood, buttoning his jacket. He turned to the judge, then to the packed courtroom. He began to pace, weaving a narrative of a brilliant, self-made man dragged down by a leech. "Your Honor," Whitman began, gesturing grandly at Nathaniel, "we are here to correct a mistake. 20 years ago, my client, a visionary, married a woman he thought would be a partner. Instead, he found a dependent. For 2 decades, Nathaniel Cross has built the skyline of this city. He has revitalized the chaotic meatpacking district. He has erected towers in Midtown. He has generated wealth that supports thousands of families. And what did Ms. Sinclair do?" He pointed an accusatory finger at Genevieve, who was busy writing something in her notebook. "She spent," Whitman declared. "She attended galas she didn't pay for. She lived in homes she didn't clean. She has contributed 0 financial capital to the Cross Empire. And now, she asks for half. It is not just legally unsound, Your Honor. It is morally bankrupt. We intend to prove that the prenuptial agreement signed in 2005 is valid, that the assets in question are sole property, and that Ms. Sinclair is entitled to nothing more than the compassionate stipend Mr. Cross has generously offered." Nathaniel nodded solemnly, looking the part of the benevolent victim. Judge Banks looked at Genevieve. "Ms. Sinclair, your opening?" Genevieve stood up again. Her hands were shaking slightly. "I have no opening statement, Your Honor. I would prefer to let the evidence speak." Judge Banks raised an eyebrow. "Unusual strategy. Very well. Call your first witness, Mr. Whitman." We call Nathaniel Cross to the stand. As Nathaniel walked to the witness box, he locked eyes with Genevieve. He expected to see fear. He expected to see tears. Instead, he saw something that unsettled him. She was looking at him with a strange, detached pity. It annoyed him. He decided then and there that he wouldn't just win, he would humiliate her. He placed his hand on the Bible. He swore to tell the truth. It was the first lie of the day. The direct examination was a masterclass in ego-stroking. Whitman lobbed softballs, and Nathaniel hit them out of the park. "Mr. Cross, can you tell the court about the acquisition of the Hudson Yards property?" Whitman asked. Nathaniel leaned back, comfortable in the spotlight. It was a battlefield, 2010. Everyone said the zoning couldn't be changed. I spent 6 months in meetings with City Council. I personally negotiated the air rights. I put up my own liquidity when the banks got cold feet. Genevieve, Ms. Sinclair was in the Hamptons at the time, I believe, painting watercolors. A ripple of laughter went through the gallery. "And the funding for your initial ventures?" Whitman asked. "Did Ms. Sinclair contribute to the seed capital for Cross Developments?" "Not a dime," Nathaniel said firmly. "I started with a loan from my father and my own savings. Genevieve came from humble beginnings, a small town in Rhode Island. Her family had nothing. When I met her, she was working in a bakery. I lifted her out of that life. So, to clarify, Whitman pressed, ensuring the court reporter got every word. Every asset, every building, every acre of land in the Cross portfolio was acquired through your effort, your financing, and your negotiation. 100%, Nathaniel stated. She was a housewife, and not a particularly attentive one. Objection, Genevieve said softly. Judge Banks looked at her. On what grounds? Relevance, she said, her voice steadying. My housekeeping skills are not on trial. The division of assets is. Sustained, Banks grumbled. Stick to the money, Mr. Whitman. Whitman bowed slightly. Of course. Let's talk about the crown jewel, the Cross Manor in Westchester. 150 acres, valued at $85 million. Who purchased that land? I did, Nathaniel said. Bought it from a failing trust in 2012. I designed the house myself. It's my masterpiece. I intended it to be a legacy for my children, should I ever have them. Genevieve hates the place. She calls it a mausoleum. And the deed? It is in the name of Cross Holdings, LLC, a company solely owned by me. Whitman smiled. Thank you, Mr. Cross. Your witness. Whitman sat down, looking smug. He had painted a clear picture. Nathaniel the Titan, Genevieve the parasite. Judge Banks turned to Genevieve. Ms. Sinclair, do you have any questions for Mr. Cross? Genevieve stood up. She picked up a single file folder from her table. She walked slowly toward the witness stand. Up close, Nathaniel noticed she looked tired, but her eyes were clear. There was a hardness in them he hadn't seen before. Hello, Nathaniel, she said. Ms. Sinclair, he replied coldly. You stated that you are a self-made man, she began, that my family had nothing. It's a matter of public record, Genevieve. Your father was a fisherman. Your mother was a school teacher. Honest work, but hardly high finance. And you stated that you purchased the land for our home, the Westchester estate, from a failing trust? That's correct. Do you remember the name of that trust? Genevieve asked. Nathaniel frowned. He hadn't expected specific questions about paperwork. He had people for that. I believe it was the Providence Land Preservation Trust, or something similar. It was a distressed asset. I got it for pennies on the dollar. Pennies on the dollar, Genevieve repeated. And why was it distressed? Because nobody wanted it, Nathaniel scoffed. It was overgrown, swampy. I saw the potential where others saw weeds. Did you ever meet the trustee who signed the sale? Nathaniel checked his watch. I don't recall. My lawyers handled the closing. I simply signed the check. Genevieve pulled a document from her folder. Your Honor, I would like to enter Defense Exhibit A, a copy of the check Mr. Cross signed for the purchase of the Westchester property. Whitman stood up. Objection. We haven't seen this. It's your client's check, Mr. Whitman. Judge Banks deadpanned. I'm sure you've seen it. Overruled. Genevieve handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge and then to Nathaniel. Nathaniel, Genevieve said, her voice dropping an octave. Look at the amount. $4 million, Nathaniel read. And look at the date. October 14th, 2012. Now, Genevieve said, reaching back into her folder. You claimed you used your own liquidity, your own money. Can you tell the court where that $4 million came from? Nathaniel rolled his eyes. From my operating account at Chase. And how did the money get into that account? I am a developer, Genevieve. I make deals, cash flows in and out. Isn't it true? Genevieve asked, taking a step closer, that on October 12, 2012, 2 days before you bought the land, a transfer of $4 million was made into your account from a joint savings account that you had forgotten about. An account in the name of G. Sinclair? The courtroom went silent. Nathaniel blinked. He genuinely didn't remember that. I handle millions of dollars a week, he stammered. If you moved money, it was likely money I had given you for household expenses. $4 million for groceries? Genevieve asked. I don't know what you're trying to prove, Nathaniel snapped, his composure cracking slightly. Even if you chipped in for the land, the house is worth $80 million. I built the house. The land is a fraction of the value. Genevieve smiled. It was a small, sad smile. That's what you think, Nathaniel. You think the value is in the bricks you stacked. You never understood that the value is in the earth itself. She turned to the judge. I have no further questions for this witness regarding the money, but I would like to reserve the right to recall him regarding the deed itself. Reserved, Judge Banks said, looking at Genevieve with newfound interest. You may step down, Mr. Cross. Nathaniel stormed back to his table. What was that? He hissed at Whitman. Did she give me $4 million? Whitman was furiously typing on his laptop. I'm checking the 2012 records. It looks like, damn it, there was a transfer from a Sinclair family trust. Why didn't you tell me she had a trust? Because she doesn't, Nathaniel whispered, shouted. Her father was a fisherman. Apparently, Whitman muttered, looking at the screen. He was a very successful fisherman. Judge Banks cleared his throat. Call your next witness, Mr. Whitman, or are we done with the fiction portion of the program? Whitman stood, flustered. We rest our case for the plaintiff, Your Honor. The assets are clearly titled to Mr. Cross. A minor contribution from the wife does not negate 20 years of sole ownership. Very well, Judge Banks said. Ms. Sinclair, the floor is yours. Genevieve stood. She didn't call a witness. She didn't call an expert. She simply picked up a large, rolled-up tube of paper from under the table. It looked old. Your Honor, she said, I don't have witnesses. I only have history. Mr. Cross believes he owns the land our house sits on. He believes he owns the land his office sits on. He even believes he is the most powerful person in this room. She walked toward the bench, clutching the tube. But in his haste to acquire, he never bothered to read the fine print of the history of New York. He mentioned the Providence Land Preservation Trust sold him our home. He assumed it was a bank. She placed the tube on the plaintiff's table, right in front of a confused Nathaniel. It wasn't a bank, Nathaniel, she said softly. It was my grandmother. The silence in courtroom 4B was no longer empty. It was heavy, suffocating. It pressed against Nathaniel Cross's chest like a physical weight. He stared at the rolled-up parchment Genevieve had placed on the table. It looked archaic, the edges yellowed and frayed, a stark contrast to the crisp, white legal briefs Whitman had stacked like a fortress. Your grandmother? Nathaniel let out a dry, incredulous laugh. Genevieve, we are in a court of law, not a creative writing class. Your grandmother lived in a nursing home in Providence. She knitted socks. Genevieve didn't look at him. She looked at Judge Banks. May I unfold this, Your Honor? Please, Judge Banks said, leaning over the bench. His interest was piqued. In 40 years on the bench, he had seen screaming matches, bribery attempts, and hidden affairs. He had never seen a document that looked like it belonged in a museum. Genevieve carefully unrolled the paper. It was large, covering half the defense table. The calligraphy was dense, written in fading black ink. Nathaniel is right about one thing, Genevieve said, her voice gaining a steely resonance. My father was a fisherman. He loved the sea. He hated the city. He hated pretension, and he hated greed. But what Nathaniel didn't bother to find out, because he never asked, was why he was a fisherman. She smoothed the paper flat. My father was born William Tobias Sinclair Thorve. He was the sole heir to the Sinclair Land Trust, established in 1895. The Sinclairs didn't build skyscrapers, Nathaniel. They owned the ground before the skyscrapers were even a dream. They owned the farms that became the suburbs. They owned the ports that became the city. Whitman, the shark attorney, was frantically scrolling on his phone, his face drained of color. Mr. Cross, he whispered, his voice trembling. I'm looking at the property records for the Westchester estate. The grantor wasn't a bank. It's listed as PLPT, trustee. I assumed it was a corporate shell. It stands for Providence Land Preservation Trust, Genevieve corrected. My grandmother, Matilda Sinclair, was the trustee. And when you bought the land for the Westchester house, you didn't buy the fee simple title. You were so arrogant, so sure you were ripping off a naive seller that you didn't have your lawyers read the habendum clause. The what? Nathaniel snapped. I have a deed. It says Nathaniel Cross right on the front. Read the fine print, Your Honor, Genevieve said, pointing to a paragraph in the center of the old document. Judge Banks put on a second pair of glasses, magnifying specs. He squinted at the text. He read it silently first, his lips moving. Then he looked up, his eyes wide. It says here, Judge Banks read aloud, his voice booming, that the grantee, Nathaniel Cross, shall hold the rights of usage and improvement upon said land for the duration of his lawful union to Genevieve Sinclair. Should said union be dissolved by the intent of the grantee, or should the grantee fail to uphold the moral standards of the Sinclair Trust, the land and all improvements thereon shall revert immediately to the trust. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were typing furiously. Whitman dropped his pen. That's not legal, Nathaniel roared, jumping to his feet. That's archaic. You can't enforce a clause like that. I built an $80 million house on that land. Sit down, Mr. Cross. Judge Banks slammed his gavel. And you are correct. Usually, such reversionary clauses are difficult to enforce. However, the judge looked closer at the document. This isn't a standard sale. This is a conditional grant of stewardship. You signed it, Mr. Cross. Your signature is right here, next to Matilda Sinclair's. I sign 100 documents a day, Nathaniel yelled. I don't read every line of boilerplate text. Then you are a fool, Judge Banks said coldly, because you just agreed that you don't own your house. You are merely a tenant. And since you filed for divorce, dissolving the union by the intent of the grantee, you have triggered the clause. This is entrapment, Whitman shouted. My client was misled. Misled? Genevieve turned to Nathaniel, her eyes blazing. You approached the trust to buy the land. You offered a lowball price because you thought they were desperate. My grandmother agreed to the price because of the clause. She wanted to protect me. She knew who you were, Nathaniel. She knew you were a wolf. She just wanted to make sure that if you ever bit me, you'd break your teeth. Nathaniel slumped into his chair. The house is gone? The house is an improvement upon said land, Genevieve quoted. It belongs to the trust. It belongs to me. Nathaniel felt bile rise in his throat. The Westchester estate was his pride. He had invited senators there. He had filmed interviews there. And now it belonged to the woman he had called boring. But Genevieve wasn't done. She reached into her satchel and pulled out another roll of paper. This one was thicker, bound with a red ribbon. That was just our home, Nathaniel, she said. Now, let's talk about your business. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a legal proceeding to a public execution. The gallery was buzzing with a mix of shock and delight. Nothing pleases a crowd more than seeing a giant stumble. Nathaniel was breathing hard, his face a mask of red fury. Whitman was whispering frantically into his ear, likely outlining appeals and lawsuits against the grandmother's estate. But Nathaniel wasn't listening. He was staring at the second roll of paper in Genevieve's hand. "What is that?" he rasped. "This," Genevieve said, "is the master deed for the parcel of land known as City Block 405. Nathaniel froze. Block 405 was the site of the Cross Tower, his headquarters, a 60-story glass needle that pierced the Manhattan sky. It was the heart of his operation. "I own the Cross Tower," Nathaniel said, his voice shaking. "I bought the land from the city in 2008. It was a redevelopment zone." "You bought the development rights from the city," Genevieve corrected gently. "The city didn't own the land, Nathaniel. The city held a 99-year lease on the land, granted in 1915. Do you know who the grantor was?" Nathaniel stared at her. He didn't want to say it. "The Sinclair Trust," Judge Banks answered for him, anticipating the blow. Genevieve nodded. "My great-grandfather leased the land to the city for public use, with the option to sublease for commercial development. But there was a catch. The lease expires in 2025, unless renewed by the direct descendant of the Sinclair line." She checked her watch. "It is January 2026. The lease expired last week." "And the city would have renewed it," Whitman stammered. "Eminent domain. Adverse possession." "The city tried," Genevieve said. "They sent the renewal paperwork to the address on file. But the trust address had changed. They sent it to the old office in Providence. It was returned to sender." "So?" Nathaniel demanded. "A clerical error doesn't strip me of $1 billion building." "It does when the contract states that failure to renew results in immediate reversion of title," Genevieve said. "The city lost the rights. The rights reverted to the trust. To me. And since you, Nathaniel, are the sublessee, your contract is with the landholder." She placed the ribbon-bound document on the judge's bench. "Judge Banks, if you look at the addendum on page 4, you will see the terms for a hostile tenant." Judge Banks opened the document. His hands were actually trembling slightly. He wasn't just a judge right now. He was a student of history, witnessing the unearthing of a buried empire. He read the page. He looked up at Nathaniel with a look that wasn't anger, but profound pity. "Mr. Cross," Banks said, "according to this, since the lease has expired and the title has reverted, you are currently trespassing on Sinclair land. Furthermore, there is a penalty clause for unauthorized commercial exploitation of the land after the lease expiration. The penalty is substantial." "How substantial?" Whitman asked, his voice a squeak. 300% of gross revenue generated on the property," Banks read. "That's impossible," Nathaniel screamed. "That's bankruptcy. That's everything." "It's the contract," Banks said. "The law is the law." But then, Judge Banks paused. He was still holding the deed to the Cross Tower land. His thumb brushed over the bottom corner of the parchment, where the legal description of the adjacent plots was listed. The judge's eyes narrowed. He looked around his own courtroom. He looked at the high ceilings, the mahogany paneling, the brass seal of the city on the wall. He looked back at the deed. "Ms. Sinclair," Judge Banks said, his voice dropping to a whisper that the microphones barely picked up. "This deed, it covers Block 405. "Yes, Your Honor." "And Block 406? "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Banks slowly closed the file. He took off his glasses. He looked at the court reporter, then at the bailiff. "Block 406, Judge Banks said, addressing the room, is the address of this courthouse. A gasp went through the room. "You mean," Nathaniel started, his eyes darting around. "I mean," Judge Banks said, turning to Genevieve, "that the ground we are sitting on right now, this building, the seat of justice for this district, belongs to your family." Genevieve nodded solemnly. The Sinclair family donated the use of the land to the court system in 1920. My grandfather believed in justice. He wanted to ensure that the law was upheld. She walked closer to the bench. "But," she continued, "the deed of donation has a revocation clause. Should the halls of justice be used to perpetuate injustice, or should the integrity of the court be mocked by the arrogance of wealth, the Sinclair family reserves the right to reclaim the land." She turned to Nathaniel. "You came into this courtroom, Nathaniel, thinking you could buy the outcome. You mocked the proceedings. You insulted the process. You thought your money made you immune to the rules." She looked up at Judge Banks. "I am not here to evict the court, Your Honor. I respect the law. But I am here to point out that Nathaniel Cross is standing on my floor in a building that exists by my family's grace, demanding that I be left penniless." Judge Banks sat back in his chair. He looked at the deed on his desk. He saw the signature at the bottom, Tobias Sinclair, and below it, the small embossed seal of the family. The judge picked up the deed. He held it up to the light. "I have been a judge for 30 years, Banks said. "I have never seen a litigant walk into a courtroom they effectively own." He looked at Nathaniel. "Mr. Cross, you are not just fighting a divorce case. You are fighting the landlord of the very ground that sustains your business, your home, and apparently the civil court of New York." Nathaniel's face was gray. The invincible tycoon was gone. In his place was a man realizing he was standing on a trapdoor and his wife had just pulled the lever. "What do you want?" Nathaniel whispered. "Genevieve, what do you want?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "What do you want?" It was the question Nathaniel always asked when he wanted to make a problem go away. He expected a number. He expected a dollar amount. 10 million? 50? Genevieve looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't want your money, Nathaniel," she said. "I have plenty. As you can see, the accumulated rents from the Sinclair Trust over the last century are considerable. My poverty was a choice. I wanted to live a life of substance, not status. I wanted to see if you loved me, or if you loved the accessory I could be." She walked back to her table and began packing her bag. "I gave you 20 years, she said. "I supported you when you were stressed. I nursed you when you were sick. I hosted your dinners and laughed at your repetitive jokes. And when you decided to discard me, you didn't just ask for a divorce. You tried to destroy me. You tried to make me homeless." She zipped up her satchel. "So, to answer your question," she said, turning back to him, "I want the truth to be the record. I want the deed to the Westchester house recognized as trust property. You have 30 days to vacate. I want the Cross Tower lease renegotiated at fair market value, which, given your hostile tenant status, will be quite high. And I want an apology." "An apology?" Nathaniel blinked. "That's it?" "Not to me," Genevieve said. "I don't care about your words anymore. I want you to apologize to the court. You came here treating this institution like your personal trash can. You wasted Judge Banks's time. You insulted the dignity of the law." Whitman nudged Nathaniel. "Do it," he hissed. "Apologize. If she enforces the reversion clause on the tower, you are insolvent by Tuesday." Nathaniel Cross, the man who never bowed, the man who looked down on the world from the penthouse, slowly stood up. His legs felt like lead. He looked at Judge Banks. He looked at the gallery, where the reporters were recording every twitch of his face. Nathaniel's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. I apologize to the court. I allowed my personal animosity to cloud my judgment. I respect the proceedings. And? Genevieve prompted. Nathaniel turned to her. It was physically painful for him. And I underestimated you, Genevieve. I thought you were weak because you were kind. I was wrong. Genevieve nodded. Thank you, Nathaniel. She turned to Judge Banks. Your Honor, regarding the division of assets, since the plaintiff has practically no assets that are not subject to my family's liens or reversion clauses, I am willing to drop the countersuit for alimony. He can keep his liquid cash. He's going to need it to pay the back rent on his office. Judge Banks tried to hide a smile. Ms. Sinclair, are you suggesting a settlement? I am suggesting mercy, Your Honor, Genevieve said. Something my husband knows nothing about. I will grant him a new lease on the Cross Tower. 1 year. Renewable at my discretion. He can keep his company. But he answers to the trust. He answers to me. Nathaniel looked like he had been punched in the gut. He would be working for her. He would be her tenant. Every time he walked into his own building, he would know who owned the floor. Mr. Whitman, Judge Banks said, do you accept this offer? Or would you like to litigate the validity of the 1895 Sinclair Trust against the finest forensic accountants I'm sure Ms. Sinclair can hire? Whitman looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel stared at the table, defeated. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. We accept, Whitman mumbled. Very well, Judge Banks said. He picked up his gavel. Judgment is entered in favor of the defendant, Genevieve Sinclair. The property known as the Westchester Estate is recognized as the property of the Sinclair Trust. The lease on Block 405 is subject to the terms dictated by the trust. The judge paused. He looked at the deed to the courthouse still sitting on his desk. And Ms. Sinclair, Banks added. Regarding Block 406, Genevieve smiled. The courthouse remains as it is, Your Honor, as long as justice is served. Today, I believe it was. Judge Banks smiled back, a genuine, warm smile. Court is adjourned. The gavel banged. It sounded like a gunshot ending a war. The courtroom exploded into noise. Reporters surged forward. Whitman began shoving papers into his briefcase, desperate to escape. Nathaniel stood frozen, watching his wife, his ex-wife, walk toward the exit. But the story wasn't quite over. As Genevieve reached the heavy mahogany doors, a man in a dark suit stepped out from the back row of the gallery. He wasn't a reporter. He was older, distinguished, holding a cane. He intercepted Nathaniel as he stumbled down the aisle. Mr. Cross? The man asked. What? Nathaniel snapped, his eyes wild. I have nothing to say to the press. I'm not the press, the man said smoothly. I'm Charles Sterling. I represent the board of directors for Cross Holdings. Nathaniel straightened up. Charles, I didn't know you were here. We've been watching, Sterling said. His voice was cold. The board has been live streaming the audio. It's a setback, Nathaniel said quickly, his salesman mode kicking in. But I saved the company. I got the lease renewed. We're still in business. You are, Sterling corrected. The company is. But you, Nathaniel, you are a liability. What are you talking about? The morality clause in your CEO contract, Sterling said. It states that the CEO must not engage in conduct that brings public embarrassment or catastrophic financial risk to the firm. Today, you did both. You lost the company's biggest asset because you didn't read a deed, and you are now personally subservient to our landlord. Sterling handed Nathaniel a white envelope. The board met 10 minutes ago via conference call. This is your termination notice. effective immediately. Nathaniel stared at the envelope. "You can't fire me. I built this company." "You built it on someone else's land," Sterling said. "And now, we need someone who can negotiate with Ms. Sinclair without the baggage of a failed marriage. Goodbye, Nathaniel." Sterling walked away, heading straight for Genevieve. Nathaniel watched as his own board member shook his ex-wife's hand, treating her with the reverence of a queen. Nathaniel Cross stood alone in the center of the courtroom. He had walked in with $1 billion and a plan to destroy his wife. He was walking out with a check for his severance, no home, no job, and the realization that the boring woman he married was the only reason he had ever been anything at all. The weeks following the verdict were a blur of rain and humiliation for Nathaniel Cross. The media, once his adoring choir, had turned into a pack of ravenous wolves. The headline of the New York Post the day after the trial didn't mince words. "Cross crushed. Wife owns the pavement." Nathaniel sat in the corner booth of a diner in Queens, a far cry from the Michelin-starred establishments he used to frequent. He stirred a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at his phone. His contacts list was a graveyard. Calls to his former partners went to voicemail. Emails to his friends bounced back. The Manhattan elite were like a school of fish. When the current changed, they all turned in unison, leaving the slow behind to die. He had been evicted from the penthouse. It turned out the company paid for the lease, and since he was no longer the CEO, the perk had evaporated within 48 hours. He was currently staying in a corporate suite at a mid-range hotel, paid for by the severance package that was rapidly shrinking due to legal fees. His phone buzzed. It was Whitman. "Nathaniel," the lawyer said, his voice clipped. "I'm sending over the final bill." "I thought we were done, Bradley," Nathaniel muttered. "We are. I'm dropping you as a client. The Bar Association is investigating me for incompetence regarding the deed research. I can't be associated with you anymore. It's bad for the brand." The line went dead. Nathaniel laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. He looked out the window. Across the street, a massive billboard displayed a new advertisement. It was for the Sinclair Community Initiative. It featured a picture of the Cross Tower, now rebranded simply as the 405, with a tagline, "Affordable workspaces for non-profits and local artisans." Genevieve wasn't just taking his building, she was erasing his identity. She was filling his glass and steel monument to capitalism with artisans. Driven by a masochistic urge, Nathaniel hailed a cab and gave the address of his old office. He needed to see it. He needed to see if he had left a mark. When he arrived at the plaza, the security guards, men he had hired, men whose names he had never bothered to learn, stopped him at the turnstile. "Mr. Cross," the head guard said, stepping in front of him, "I can't let you up." "I just want to get my personal effects, Frank," Nathaniel lied. "We boxed them up and mailed them to your hotel, sir. Ms. Sinclair's orders. No unauthorized entry for former employees." "Former employee?" Nathaniel seethed. "I designed the lobby. I chose this marble." "It's nice marble, sir," Frank said impassively. "Please step back." As Nathaniel turned to leave, the elevator doors pinged open. A group of people walked out, chatting excitedly. In the center was Genevieve. She looked different. The severe bun was gone, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore a tailored cream suit that screamed quiet luxury, the kind that doesn't need logos to prove its worth. Walking next to her was Charles Sterling, the board member who had fired Nathaniel. They were laughing. Nathaniel froze. He wanted to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. Genevieve saw him. She stopped. The laughter died on her lips, replaced by a calm, professional mask. She said something to Sterling, who nodded and walked toward the waiting town car. Genevieve walked over to Nathaniel. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She looked busy. "Hello, Nathaniel," she said. "You turned my tower into a flea market," he spat, his defense mechanism kicking in. "It's a mixed-use incubator," she corrected. "We're giving reduced rent to startups that focus on sustainability and education. The board loves it. The PR value alone has tripled the stock price since you left." "The stock went up?" Nathaniel felt faint. "Skyrocketed," Genevieve said. "Investors like stability, Nathaniel. They like long-term land security. They didn't like the volatility of a CEO who was one divorce away from losing the headquarters." She checked her watch. "I have a meeting with the mayor. Was there something you needed?" "I need..." Nathaniel struggled. He wanted to scream. He wanted to beg. "I need to know why you waited. Why did you let me build all this if you knew you could take it away?" Genevieve sighed. She looked at the building, then back at him. "I didn't wait to trap you, Nathaniel. I waited for you to change. Every year, I hoped you would stop being obsessed with more. I hoped you would look at the Westchester house and see a home, not an asset. I hoped you would look at me and see a wife, not a trophy." She stepped closer, her voice soft but unyielding. "You built your empire on my family's land, but you built your life on the assumption that I was stupid. That was your only mistake. You can build a lot of things on a lie, Nathaniel, but you can't build a legacy." She signaled to Frank. "Let him wait in the lobby if it's raining, but he doesn't go up." With that, she walked out the revolving doors and into the city that was, quite literally, her town. 3 years later, the iron gates of the Westchester estate, which had once been painted a glossy, imposing black and tipped with gold leaf, were now a soft, weathered matte grey. They stood wide open. The security booth where Nathaniel Cross used to station armed guards to keep the riffraff out was now filled with bags of organic feed and stacks of colourful horse blankets. A hand-painted wooden sign hung from the stone pillar. It didn't boast of exclusivity or wealth. Instead, it read simply, "The Matilda Sinclair Sanctuary for Retired Service Animals." A silver Honda Accord, 5 years old, and sporting a small dent on the rear bumper, crunched slowly up the gravel driveway. Inside, Nathaniel Cross gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He didn't belong here. He knew that. The GPS on his phone had chirped, "You have arrived." But looking out the windshield, he felt like he had landed on a different planet. The meticulous, chemical green lawns that used to cost $50,000 a month to manicure were gone. In their place was a riot of native wildflowers, purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and tall, swaying stalks of goldenrod. The carefully sculpted topiaries that Nathaniel had once screamed at a gardener for trimming asymmetrically were now wild and overgrown, providing shade for a group of napping goats. Nathaniel parked the car near what used to be the garage for his collection of Ferraris. Now, the garage doors were open, revealing a workshop filled with carpentry tools and muddy boots. He stepped out of the car. He adjusted his suit jacket, a nervous tic that had survived the collapse of his empire. The suit was off the rack, a polyblend that didn't breathe well in the humid, late summer air. He worked now as a mid-level logistics consultant for a shipping firm in New Jersey. It was a job where no one knew his name, and where urgency meant a missing pallet of toaster ovens, not a billion-dollar merger. He walked toward the paddock. The silence of the place was striking. It wasn't the sterile silence of an empty mansion. It was the living silence of nature. The buzz of bees, the rustle of wind, the distant whinny of a horse. He saw her then. Genevieve was standing by the wooden fence, her back to him. She was wearing muddy rubber boots, worn-out jeans, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her hair, which he had always insisted she wear in a tight, elegant chignon, hung loose in messy chestnut waves down her back. She was brushing the flank of a massive, scarred horse. The animal looked old, its coat graying at the muzzle, but it leaned into her touch with absolute trust. Nathaniel watched her for a long moment. During their marriage, he had seen her at galas, draped in diamonds he had bought to show off his own success. He had seen her at the dinner table, listening quietly while he monologued about zoning laws. But he realized, with a pang of sharp regret that hit him in the chest, that he had never actually seen her. He had seen a prop. He hadn't seen the woman who could calm a 1,000-pound animal with a whisper. "He doesn't like sudden movements," a voice said. Nathaniel jumped. A man had walked up beside him, carrying 2 heavy buckets of water. He was tall, wearing a t-shirt stained with grass and sweat, with kind eyes and a strong jaw. This was Dr. Caleb Aris, the sanctuary's head veterinarian. "I wasn't going to startle him," Nathaniel said, his voice sounding thinner than he remembered. "I used to live here." Dr. Aris looked at him, then at the house, then back at Nathaniel. He didn't look impressed, nor did he look intimidated. "I know who you are, Mr. Cross. Genevieve told me you might come by one day. She said ghosts always check their old haunts eventually." "Is she happy?" Nathaniel asked. The question slipped out before he could stop it. Dr. Aris smiled, a genuine expression that made Nathaniel feel incredibly small. "Look at her. What do you think?" He walked away toward the barn, leaving Nathaniel alone with the view. Genevieve turned around. She shielded her eyes from the sun, and when she recognized the figure standing by the fence, she didn't flinch. She gave the horse a final pat and walked over to the gate, unlatching it with practiced ease. "Hello, Nathaniel," she said. Her voice was different. The tentative, apologetic tone was gone. It was deeper, resonant with the authority of someone who owns the ground she stands on. "Genevieve," he nodded. He gestured vaguely at the field. "You let the landscaping go." "I let the life come back," she corrected gently. She wiped her hands on a rag hanging from her belt. "That horse is Buster. He served in the mounted police for 12 years. He was going to be euthanized because of arthritis. Now he owns the south pasture." "It's nice," Nathaniel lied. It wasn't just nice. It was peaceful in a way he had never achieved with all his marble and glass. "And the house?" "The ballroom is a dormitory for veterinary students," she said. "The wine cellar is used for cold storage for medicine and root vegetables. We use every square inch, Nathaniel, but we use it for things that matter." She leaned against the fence, studying him. She didn't offer him a drink. She didn't invite him inside. The boundary was clear. "I saw the news," Nathaniel said, shifting his weight. "About the courthouse. Block 406. Genevieve nodded. "We finalized the paperwork last week." "You donated it," Nathaniel said, the disbelief still evident in his tone. "You held the deed to the Manhattan Civil Courthouse. You could have charged the city millions in rent. You could have forced them to build you a statue. And you just signed it over?" "The deed had a purpose, Nathaniel," Genevieve explained, as if talking to a child who was struggling with a math problem. "My great-grandfather wrote that clause to ensure the court remained just. When Judge Banks ruled in my favor, he proved the system still worked. He proved that truth mattered more than money. Once that was proven, the Sinclair Trust had no business holding a sword over the head of justice. So I gave it back." "You gave away leverage," Nathaniel muttered, his old instincts flaring up. "You gave away power." Genevieve laughed. It was a bright, free sound, that startled a flock of birds nearby. Oh, Nathaniel, you still don't get it, do you? Power isn't holding a deed to a building where people get divorced or sued. Power is waking up in the morning and not being afraid of losing anything, because you don't need anything you can't carry in your heart. She looked at his suit, his car, his tired eyes. You lost the tower, Nathaniel. You lost the penthouse. You lost the board seat. But looking at you now, you look like you're carrying more weight than you ever did when you were rich. Nathaniel looked down at his shoes. They were scuffed. I'm working in logistics, he admitted quietly. New Jersey. It's quiet. No one asks me for quotes. No one takes my picture. Is that why you came? She asked. To see if I missed the excitement? To see if I missed you? No, Nathaniel said. He took a deep breath. This was the moment he had rehearsed on the drive over. The moment he had dreaded for 3 years. I came because I realized something. When Sterling fired me, when the security guards escorted me out of the lobby, I was furious. I blamed you. I blamed the judge. I blamed the deed. He looked up, meeting her gaze. But then, about 6 months ago, I was sitting in my apartment, and I found an old box of photos. I found a picture of us from our honeymoon in Italy. You were smiling. You looked so hopeful. And I remembered that I spent that entire trip on the phone with my architects. Genevieve's expression softened, just a fraction. I came to apologize, Nathaniel said, his voice cracking. Not for the cheating, or the prenup, or the courtroom theatrics. I apologized for those to the judge. I want to apologize for making you feel small so that I could feel big. I treated you like an acquisition. And looking at you now, looking at what you've built from the wreckage, I realize I was the one who was empty. The wind rustled through the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Genevieve watched him. She didn't rush to absolve him. She let his words hang in the air, let them settle and take root. Thank you, Nathaniel, she said finally. I needed to hear that. Not for my sake. I found my peace a long time ago, but for yours. Do you hate me? He asked. No, she said instantly. Hate takes too much energy. I have fences to mend and horses to feed. I don't have time for hate. She smiled, and this time it was a smile of closure. I actually pity you, Nathaniel. You spent 20 years running a race that no one else was running, and when you finally crossed the finish line, you found out you were at the wrong stadium. But you're still breathing. You have a job. You have a life. You can start over. Just try to build something real this time, even if it's small. Dr. Aris called out from the barn. Genevieve, the new foal is waking up. Genevieve's face lit up with a joy that Nathaniel had never been able to give her. I have to go, she said. She didn't shake his hand. She didn't hug him. She simply nodded, a final acknowledgement of a shared history that was now closed forever. Goodbye, Nathaniel, she said. Goodbye, Genevieve. She turned and ran toward the barn, her boots thudding softly on the earth. She didn't look back. Nathaniel stood alone in the driveway. He looked at the massive stone house one last time. He looked at the window of the master bedroom, the room where he had once plotted his takeovers. It was open, and white linen curtains were billowing in the breeze. He realized then that the deed hadn't just stripped him of the property, it had stripped him of his delusions. He was no longer the titan of industry. He was just a man in a cheap suit, standing in a driveway that didn't belong to him. And strangely, for the first time in decades, he felt light. The crushing pressure to be more was gone, because he was now nothing. And from nothing, he could perhaps, finally, become someone. He walked back to his dented Honda. He started the engine, which rattled slightly in the quiet sanctuary air. As he drove down the long, winding driveway, past the wildflowers and the grazing horses, he passed the wooden sign one last time. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, driving away from the empire of glass he had lost, and toward the uncertain, humble future he had finally earned. The story of Nathaniel and Genevieve serves as a brutal reminder that in the game of life, the loudest player isn't always the winner. Nathaniel Cross believed that power came from what you could seize, sign, and build. He measured his worth in square footage and stock options, but he failed to realize that true power often lies in the hands of those who listen, those who preserve, and those who hold the history that others ignore. Genevieve Sinclair didn't win because she had a better lawyer. She won because she knew who she was. She understood that a legacy isn't about how high you build, but how deep your roots go. In the end, the arrogant architect was evicted by the quiet librarian, proving that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a courtroom isn't the shark in the suit. It's the woman with the dusty roll of paper who knows exactly what it says. And that is the story of how one forgotten deed brought down a billionaire's empire. It's crazy to think that he was standing on her land the entire time and didn't even know it. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want to hear more stories about underdogs winning against the odds, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done if you were Genevieve? Would you have taken the building, or would you have settled earlier? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.